Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Thank you so much for tuning in today for this webinar, which focuses on accountability in resourcing Kenya's COVID-19 response. Based on registrations, we have a diverse audience from university students to development practitioners and partners to folks working in the accountability space. Your host and moderator today is IREX. We're a non-profit organization working with partners globally for a more just, prosperous, and inclusive world. Among the various themes that we work around, governance is a critical one, which explains why we're here today, having collaborated with the Ford Foundation to deliver this webinar, the first in a series of 3 that focuses exclusively on accountability around Kenya's COVID-19 response. Our hashtag for this event is Kenya COVID Accountability. Don't hesitate to share your thoughts on Twitter. So here's what to expect in the next 30, or rather 90 minutes. Our outcome for today is that attendees will gain insights into the underlying factors that drive corruption and mismanagement in public finance and allocation of state resources with a focus on Kenya's COVID-19 response. We're going to start off with a brief introduction, providing a background to today's discussion, introduction to the panel. Of course, we'll then dive into the panel conversation, and then finally the Q&A. But before we start, I'd like to get a sense check and see how effective you think the state has managed the pandemic response from a public finance perspective. So indulge me, and a poll should pop up on your screen now. Now end polling there. I think our first speaker, Wangari, will have this front and center as she starts us off shortly. So 60% of you think that the state's management of Kenya's pandemic response was poor, 19% very poor, 17% fair, and 4% good, 0% excellent. So in recent months, the government, alongside development partners, launched an appeal for resources to help Kenya fight the pandemic. Multilaterals, bilaterals, private sector, and government made sizable contributions and commitments, including $2 billion in aid and grants alone. In recent weeks, investigations into the misuse of COVID-19 funding have been initiated by the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission. And this follows calls from civil society and the wider public for data and transparency around expenditure in this area. Investigations have revealed at least 2.3 billion Kenya shillings is unaccounted for, and public procurement laws were flouted, with evidence of tenders being allegedly given to politically connected individuals and businesses. To support citizenry in demanding accountability, IREX, with the support of Ford Foundation, is implementing the COVID Resourcing Data Project, which seeks to improve the utilization of and accountability around Kenya's COVID-19 response. For some weeks now, IREX, like many others, have been trying to paint an objective picture of who has received how much money, from whom, and for what purpose, primarily by curating data from available sources. What's become clear is that publicly available data is limited. For this webinar, our original intention was to focus exclusively on the data and data gaps. But given the tone of the last few weeks, we think our starting point needs to be a wider conversation on accountability, transparency, and efficiency. And so this is why we're all here today. I'm very pleased to introduce our dynamic panel, starting off with Irene, who is the National Coordinator for the National Taxpayers Association and an advocate of the High Court. She brings extensive experience in governance, public sector management, and reform processes, and is particularly passionate about the provision of information to enable citizens to raise their voice and demand accountability. John Gitongo, who should be joining us shortly, is the CEO of nationwide social movement Inuka Kenya ni Sisi and publisher of the Elephant.info, a governance media platform with a weekly readership of 40,000. You'll know John is widely regarded as a fearless anti-corruption leader, and in that regard needs no introduction. Sheila Masinde is the Executive Director for Transparency International. She possesses diverse experience spanning the media, outreach, governance, and program management sectors. This includes experience with leading media and non-profits organizations, including BBC Media Action. And finally, Wangari Mukia. Wangari is a PFM specialist and the CEO and lead economist at Expertise Global Consulting, where she provides technical public sector reform advisory services to public sector actors. Previous roles include advisor to Kenya's Ministry of Finance and lead economist, fiscal decentralization at the World Bank. It's important to share that IREX reached out to government representatives to gauge their interest in being part of this conversation. Unfortunately, they won't be joining us today, but hopefully they will be for subsequent conversations. And so we'll dive straight in. But before we do, to attendees, please do share your comments in the chat box and your questions to the panel throughout this next segment. And we'll get to your questions right after. So my first question is to Wangari, directed primarily to you, but it would be great to get feedback as well from other panelists. And our question is around how effective and accountable PFM systems should operate in times of crisis or emergency. And based on your observation, how have we performed as a nation?
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you to the audience who has come for this important conversation. I'm very pleased to be here. And to answer your question, Melissa, an effective and an accountable public finance management system is able to respond to times of crisis. That is able to respond in times of crisis must be well prepared for and thereafter well implemented. Now, our constitution allows for a contingencies fund that will hold a maximum of about 10 billion Kenya shillings. And this fund has statutory parameters on reporting. And similarly, the county emergency funds that can be established by the county assemblies. So the law does have some emergency financing provisions, even if they're limited. But even in this case, there are very good reasons why we should have special funds, especially for crisis, and they can be a very good idea. A central reason why we create these funds is to simplify procedures and to accelerate spending, which is very important in times of an emergency. Some other reasons include the need for high control of measures, for example, to pool public and private resources, to coordinate interventions across different sectors and different levels of government, or to ring fence particular crisis spending. So that way you don't have your crisis spending for a particular crisis mingled in with others, kind of crises. For example, we've had the big crisis of the locust, we had flooding that happens perennially. And so you want to ring fence this funding, and when you think about COVID, in a specific fund. But there is a big downside. The absence of strong safeguards is a big challenge. Funds with independent spending authority can bypass normal budgetary and expenditure controls, and can also dilute accountability and weaken fiscal control. And this really creates big fiscal risks and increases our vulnerability to corruption. And the COVID-19 crisis really heightens this risk. So the rush to set up funds, not just in Kenya, even globally, has led to in some cases, a legal vacuum in which the fund's purpose, management, and oversight are not sufficiently defined. And the pressure on governments to respond swiftly to the crisis has often led to the relaxation of ex-ante financial controls and procurement processes, and the weakening of oversight mechanisms. So for us in Kenya, we are seeing the same issues. The biggest issues by far when it comes to accountability in this case is procurement, bar none. The Public Procurement Regulatory Authority in March issued a circular for procurement during the pandemic crisis, and this circular required that all emerging procurement be reflected in procurement plans, and the necessary approvals are sought by law. However, the authority did not issue policy direction, nor did it clarify the law with regards to the procurement in times of an emergency, especially in situations where the market for required items is uncertain, as it was during the COVID period. And also, there's been no data publicly available on COVID-19 procurement due to the urgency, and as such, it was not subject to compliance to Executive Order 2 of 2018 on the publication of procurement data. Because it was an emergency. And this is a particularly big problem for us. So my PFM colleagues and I have been debating whether the Public Procurement and Asset Disposal Act should have been suspended or amended to deal with how to ensure that procurement is done legally in an emergency. And the act in its current state requires you to advertise for 14 days, to evaluate the proposals, and then to award, which during an emergency is a real stretch. So looking internationally, comparing what Kenya has done internationally, there have been some hits and misses. So for example, most countries in the formation of their COVID funds use state budgets, some state budget, but mostly relied on private donations, public resources, and private resources. And this allowed for flexibility and increased aggregate funds. And we were able to do that in Kenya. But most funds operated globally, operated through separate banking, financial, and reporting arrangements outside of the regular PFM channels, which is problematic. We in Kenya, we use at least some elements of the regular PFM processing, as did countries such as Ghana. If you look at Togo and Honduras, they publish their information on the in their fiscal transparency portals, which is good practice to borrow from. And other good practice, for example, in Sierra Leone, they instituted interim audits to compensate for ex-ante controls so that there could be some management and oversight over overspending. But many countries like Mauritius, they didn't have any sunset clauses. And at least in the COVID fund regulations, we have a sunset clause. So how has Kenya done? Kenya did well to expediently create a COVID fund and to mobilize resources against it. But it fell in the trap of limited transparency, which raises key questions on accountability. And to date, there have been no reports on how the COVID fund was used. So we have no idea how goods and services have been procured, from who, why, and how they have been applied. And this, Melissa, is a central concern in PFM.
Thank you so much for that analysis, and apologies all for the tech sound issue earlier. Sheila and Irene, curious to see what your thoughts on this particular question is, and I will project it for everyone to be reminded.
Thank you. Melissa, can I?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. I think I really agree with sentiments by Wangari, just her analysis of, in terms of our PFM principles and our diligence in terms of applying them during this time of crisis, what really has been our performance as a country. And I think I agree, especially even with some of the sentiments that she has raised on issues around public procurement and some of the gaps that we have had to ensure that we get value for money during this very critical period, because we are looking at a situation where we have reduced resources and we already neck deep into a huge public debt crisis, but yet we have continued to spend as if things are normal, and yet as the Kenya Cabinet Secretary for Health keeps saying, that if we treat this virus normally, we will then have to take a big hit. And for me, I think that if we continue to behave normally in terms of financial management, then it will really complicate our efforts to recover as a country collectively beyond the virus. Because right now, we should have expected that would have been able then the government should have been really adhering to the principles on public finance management as set out in Chapter 12 of our Constitution, particularly on principles around openness, accountability, and even allowing public participation in some of the decision-making processes that have gone into managing this crisis, and also in oversight processes. But we've seen, even in terms of oversight, not just in terms beyond public participation, but even the involvement of oversight agencies. I think it was just 4 or 5 months into the crisis that we started hearing about, the Office of the Auditor General being involved. Okay, we also know that there was a vacuum, a big vacuum, because she was just appointed substantively a few months ago. But then, we started that process of now auditing quite late into the crisis. And then there's also just the role that other oversight agencies have played. And because they've just not even been, I feel that they've not been given the space to be able to perform the requisite oversight. The role of the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, the role of the Commission on Administrative Justice, particularly in regard to oversight in line with the public's right to access information. So I feel that we have not really lived up to the set standards under our constitutional framework. You can see from the audit report, the special audit report that was issued by the Office of the Auditor General, specifically on the KEMSA procurements for COVID-19, that there are a lot of queries raised, particularly in regard to whether we got value for money in the expenditure incurred by KEMSA, and whether some of those resources that were acquired are actually in use, because we understand that some of them are still in storage and we are not so sure whether they'll even get to be used. And at the same time, you compare that information with what is on the ground right now, that frontline health workers are complaining that some of them still don't have access to quality PPEs, but yet we understand that there are some PPEs which are still stuck in the KEMSA stores. So there are lots of questions about how we've really handled this crisis from a PFM perspective, but largely I think from the word go, we did not embrace openness, we did not embrace accountability, despite repeated calls by civil society organizations and other public-spirited Kenyans that government needed to be more proactive in terms of publishing information on contributions, allocations, disbursements, and even just on information on public procurement, which companies have been given contracts, who are the real beneficial owners of these companies, how much has been awarded, what is their expertise or experience to deliver those goods that they have been asked to provide. So there are lots of questions about PFM and really I think moving forward, and I suppose we will get to discuss that at some point in this session on how best we can move forward collectively to ensure that we apply openness, accountability, and public participation moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sheila. We're now going to move on to Irene, and I'll provide a little bit of context to this question. According to an Oxfam report, Kenya responded to the crisis with tax cuts only meant for the wealthiest and big businesses, but with limited additional funding for social protection and health measures, According to another study conducted by TIFA, 47% of respondents in slums perceive loss of employment or work as the main way in which their daily life has changed as a result of the pandemic. So Irene, initially posing this question to you, how effective have social protection measures or mechanisms been in meeting the needs of Kenyans during the pandemic? And what steps should state actors take in designing more inclusive social protection systems?
Thanks for that question, and I guess it's, and I'm really happy first to be part of this discussion, because it's one that I guess, depending on the recommendations and also what we discuss and get from this setting, can be able to inform policy direction and how we in future safeguard both the economy and also the health of Kenyans. So first, just to mention, and you've spoken about how effective really has the social protection been. Having first just looked at the media conversations around this issue, there is a sense that Kenyans feel that government has not responded as effectively on this angle as they would have expected. I will go first, if you allow, to the assertion that a lot of the tax and fiscal mechanisms that government has put in place have been a bit elitist and kind of would be biased towards people who are well off and in essence richer, so to speak. So looking at a few of them, and I'll just mention one or two just to put it into context, and I do agree that this has been the case. Recall that when government put in place some of these mechanisms, I think the problem was not taking into account the nature of our economy. I feel that they did not take effort to really look at our context, but it would in a sense be almost a copy paste of other economies that are not entirely reflective of ours. So in Kenya, and just looking at the KEPSA report, it says around 83% of Kenyans are in the informal sector. And then that is around just 17 in the formal sector. So when you look at one fiscal strategy where then you say that up to 24,000 Kenyans earning up to 24,000 will not be paying tax, how many people are really benefiting from that provision? So a lot of our people, we know the poverty levels in Kenya, so that would benefit a small, a really insignificant number of Kenyans, and particularly the ones who are exposed are not in formal employment. So that would be my first problem with some of the fiscal strategies. Of course, then the social protection would be able to mitigate some of this. Allow me also to talk on the rental income. So a lot of the strategies that government also put in place were to rely on a third party who are business entities and businessmen to pass some of these reliefs onwards to the Kenyans who should have been targeted in the first place. So you then say that you increase the upper limit of the people who would have paid or rental tax, and you're hoping that this would then move down to the citizens who occupy these homes. Because remember, a lot of the calls were that government should waive a rent, but how many homes or houses does government itself own? We have not invested as a country in social houses and issues like that. So then I would agree with that assertion and observation that a lot of the fiscal mechanisms first were really not looking at the context and the nature of our economy, both looking even at our labor market and how our people are employed. My second comment on this issue again would be, a lot of the fiscal strategies that we've seen have been national level led. But a lot of the impact for me, particularly of the marginalized groups, are groups that are majorly doing their businesses or derive their living at county level. So a lot of these strategies would really not find their way to some of these citizens. So we haven't seen things like counties saying we will waive. If at all they're ending, it hasn't been a significant, again, number of counties saying we will waive trade licenses, where a lot of the women, PWDs, the ordinary Kenyans carry out their businesses. So I would have expected also a lot of coordination between both national level interventions and county level interventions on this aspect. However, I will be also quick to note that we do understand the constraints that county levels have in regards to own source revenue. So even the tax bases that they have are limited. So this is not an option that would be open to them. But I would say there are lessons to draw and then say, how can we strengthen our counties so that they have some revenue and they can be able to say, we will cushion our people in the interim in instances where such crisis occurs. So that is the second observation, that there hasn't been much from the counties, but this is where majority of the Kenyans are. Majority of the Kenyans would want a lot of action from that level. Secondly, to look then at the issue of social protection that you've posed. So we know that Kenya has progressively made steps towards inclusive and trying to ensure that our development, in a sense, that does not leave most of our people out. So there has been, and we need to give credit in that regard, that there has been some level and of improvement in the issues of social protection. We're looking at the cash transfer that government has been affording to PWDs, to women, such issues. We're looking at social health insurance, where we have, government now has the UHC, and we are progressively seeing how NHIF can be able even to sort some of these needs of our people. However, the concern then with COVID is that, with COVID-19, is that whatever government was doing, which in a sense is around 10% of support on the issues of social protection. But now there are people who have come in who ordinarily, before COVID-19, did not require the social protection. But because of loss of jobs and other related COVID-19 issues, then they also find themselves vulnerable. How fast would government then be able to address this larger group of people? So that for me was a concern and is still a concern on the issues of social protection. We have not done enough as a country, and that would be one, the issue would have been the debt that also we have accumulated over time. So our government, unlike other governments would not be able to give as much as the Kenyans, the expectations from the Kenyans. So I would say Kenyans expected far much more, particularly on the cash transfer. We expected that each household would at least be getting something. But remember, which data would government be using? Again, our data is not very up to speed. I've just tried to have a bit of conversations with some of the Kenyans who've gotten a bit of the resources that government was putting. These are people who previously were in the system receiving a bit of support. So how are we targeting the new group that has come in? And remember, we've mentioned that some of the interventions that were specifically targeted to the market, and we were hoping that the market would be able to transfer this benefit to the citizens, that has not played out as was expected. So in terms of, you've mentioned then steps that state actors would be able to take in designing more inclusive social protection. I would say that the trend we've noticed from government is over the years to try to privatize a lot of the essential public services. We look at our healthcare systems, a lot of even the NHIF fund is set aside for the private sector, just looking at the payouts that NHIF has been paying. Looking at even the education sector, how many public schools do we have? So you find that it then becomes a challenge. If we had invested over the years in strengthened public services and gender responsive budgets, then it would be easier to then find that the system would still have taken care of this crisis we find ourselves in. But our government then wants to bring in the issues of taking care and providing safety nets in the time of a pandemic or in a time of a crisis. It requires it is actually a long-term strategy that I think we have missed. So generally, my first comment would be that government then needs to prioritize strengthening public services. We need to find a good mix of how do we bring in the private sector players, because we acknowledge they're critical, but then we also acknowledge that in time of a crisis, it is the government and the public system that then fits in. Look at a scenario of the private schools. We have seen some of them close. So if you had not invested significantly in public education, the vacuum that would have been created is huge. So those would be my comments on social protection. I think we must increase the coverage moving forward, and just not the coverage, even the amounts that we then give under these programs need to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Irene. And I think you raised some important points that are relevant not just for the context of the pandemic, but indeed as principles and approaches in establishing and maintaining social protection systems as a country. And Wangari, my question for you, following up from Irene's great summary, is, how is this possible in terms of current PFM processes? How can we ensure inclusive social protection systems in our existing structures? Do we need to establish targeted policies? Do we need to create more spaces for inclusivity, etc.?
Thank you, Melissa. I think, and thank you, Irene. I think you brought out some very interesting points and some key points that that have also been on my mind. And I think you brought out a key point around what, the national government brought out a raft of measures, but what did the county governments do? And we didn't really see the county governments providing any kind of substantive measures to support the populace within their own counties. But I think even just in addition to that, we have several cash transfer and social protection programs in Kenya. And what we found is that when this crisis happened, there was an inability to pivot to widen the net within which more people could be captured. And I think especially the urban poor. A lot of the cash transfer and social protection programs have a very clear targeted population. But in a crisis, and as you saw in many other countries, a big number of countries were immediately able to pivot and widen their net to be able to accommodate more people who had become vulnerable as a result of COVID. And I think that just goes towards thinking through the structure of these programs. How are they able to be flexible? How can you make a program that can expand and contract given the population that is coming in? And granted that COVID was hugely unexpected world over, but I think that just goes to show going forward, and even with the programs that we have, we really need to make sure that they are flexible. Another way that I think we can think about social protections and in regards to just even how the government handled it, was the fact that there was a closure of the borders putting a ring, I forget, like closing the borders in certain counties. And especially in Nairobi, because, the population, a lot of the population here come from outside of Nairobi and then come here to make a living and, on various times go back. But typically when people fall into vulnerability, the first move is to move back to the rural area where you have a home or things are cheaper, or you would be able to provide subsistence for yourself and your family much easier. And with the closure of borders, this became impossible for many of the people who were, especially the urban poor, who were stuck in Nairobi. And I think this yes, I understand that you had to curb the spread, but by the same token, if you're going to restrict the movement of people who are highly vulnerable, then provide the requisite structures to support that particular group of people. And I think that is something that is a lesson for us, because I don't think we were able to pivot. And then the last point I wanted to bring out with regards to this was the gender protections. We saw that there was a spike in teenage and underage pregnancies in certain quarters, and I think this was directly related to the fact that children are not in school, people were not at work, and so there was a vulnerability, and even there were some instances of families selling their children or giving away their children in order to get financial payment in exchange, and I think that was a big social problem that came out from there. But I think in terms of the tax reliefs, from a public finance perspective, there were some things that we needed to make sure in terms of, the reliefs that came through that may not have trickled down in the way that it was expected to. So the quantitative easing frameworks, where the government allowed the banks to lower the borrowing rate for the banks to enable the banks to then pass on those savings to small businesses, to SMEs, and I think that did happen as effectively as possible. So I think these are some things that are lessons to us, but also we could learn from different quarters, because these are things that were happening in different countries. Although, albeit that it was at a high speed because it was an unexpected event, I think there are some things that we could have done better on a social protector front, but also looking at it from a PFM angle.
Thank you so much, Wangari. Sheila, on to you. And for this question, I think we're going to intentionally look at the role of civil society in the accountability agenda when it comes to COVID-19. You'll know that in May, about 97 civil society organizations globally formally wrote to the International Monetary Fund demanding that the fund includes anti-corruption measures in its COVID-19 emergency funding and takes concrete steps to protect and empower civil society groups to monitor these funds. Taking that to the local agenda, there have been a lot of efforts that I think you and others in the sector have been rallying around. So my question is, what are the critical areas, if we were to distill 2 to 3 critical areas that civil society should align around to achieve collective impact in advocating for increased accountability in the context of the pandemic? And I say 2 to 3 areas because, of course, there are so many areas that civil society, as individual institutions and as a collective, has highlighted as areas of interest for now.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Yes, you're right. We have at the global level and even locally, nationally, one of the calls that we have repeatedly made is that for lenders, for donors, to first of all, proactively publish information on monies that they're lending or granting government, not just for the COVID-19 support, but even moving forward, any aid that is given, any loans, so that we are then able to put in place measures to ensure that those funds are not misused. And one starting point of insulating resources that are granted or loaned to countries is ensuring that citizens have information, so they're also able to monitor how these monies are allocated. And that's one of the calls that we have made during this time to development partners and lenders. But back to your question, really on some of the specific things that we need to do. And I can say that we as civil society, we as Transparency International Kenya, and working with many of our other partners, non-state actors, have been doing over the last 7 months. Because we really, one of the first things that we cautioned at the beginning of this situation in March was that corruption, as we have seen in various other emergencies, thrives during times of crisis. Corruption and emergencies like COVID-19 are besties, because at this point we find that institutions, particularly even oversight institutions, are weak and the level of public trust is low. And we have seen this in other health emergencies, like the Ebola virus, the swine flu, but yet there are people who are out to profit. And this is the most egregious form of corruption, I must say, that you want to profit out of others' misfortune when people are sick and are dying and are in hospital. And what this means is that we as civil society, as public-spirited individuals as well, must increase vigilance during this period, because people are out there profiting. So while we are here thinking that we want to help Kenyans, we want to protect livelihoods, we want to protect lives, but there's someone out there who's thinking of his own life, his own livelihood at the expense of lives, literally. So as civil society, some of the measures that we have put in place over the past few months, first of all, is just to try and track the monies that are coming in to support COVID-19 response efforts. And what we have done as TI, and we're also working with other organizations, is trying to track the funds. We have a COVID-19 tracker through one of our initiatives, which we call the Action for Transparency, traditionally tracks education and health resources and budgets. But now we are currently have set aside a portal just to track COVID-19 funding. So we've been looking at the contributions, the allocations, disbursements, and expenditure that has been reported. But I must tell you that trying to track funds in Kenya is akin to pulling teeth, because this financial information is very, very hard to come by. As a result, we have presented various requests, not just as TI Kenya, but collectively with many other civil society organizations and also non-state actors. We have presented joint requests to the Ministry of Health to give us information on how resources have been used, and also just information on other actions and decisions around COVID-19 management. But I can tell you that in the last 6 months or 7 months, not a single letter has been responded to, not even an acknowledgement that your letter has been received. So it's just like, like you see on WhatsApp, you see someone has read your message, you see those 2 blue ticks, so a letter has gone, a message has gone, but someone is not responding to you. So that's the kind of frustration that we have at the moment. No one is giving us information. A lot of the information that we get, we get it through the media. And then now, luckily, we have the audit report that has been published by the Office of the Auditor General, the special audit on KEMSA spending for COVID-19. And so we are also now trying to even push more audits, more internal audits that can even be made public, where the reports can be made public, so that we are also able to track. I think out of this frustration, as civil society, one of the things we've also been forced to do is go to court to compel the Ministry of Health to give us this information. So we currently have a matter in court together with other civil society organizations like ICJ and Katiba and Kelin, and we wait to see how that case progresses. But we hope that it will be able to change the information landscape in this country, so that when you as a Kenyan tries to exercise, the right to information, as articulated under Article 35 of this Constitution, and as articulated in the Access to Information Law that was enacted in 2016, when you write a request for information, that an agency will actually be responsible and responsive enough to give you that information, because it's not, you shouldn't be begging for it. It's your right. So one of the things I think moving forward that we need to do as civil society is collectively demand for accountability, particularly by demanding proactive disclosure of all actions, all decisions, all financial expenditure for COVID-19, and not just for COVID-19, but any other matter touching on public affairs in future, or public spending in future, because the right to information is very key, and particularly during an unprecedented crisis as this, it is very crucial that all accountability mechanisms remain effective, particularly this right to information, because it has the potential to play a major role in ensuring successful response to COVID-19. I always say that the transparency and accountability mechanisms that we put in place today will greatly determine how we recover as a country from this crisis. And at the rate at which we are going, where we are not able to get financial information, and where we are seeing a lot of corruption cases cropping out of the management of this COVID-19 pandemic, then it raises a lot of concerns on how we will recover as a country beyond COVID-19, or even if we decide to say, okay, now we're going to just live with it in a new normal, but how will we as a nation be able to live comfortably when a lot of our resources are being stolen amidst this crisis? So I think as civil society, one of the things we need to push for is collectively demand for accountability, demand that government proactively discloses all information. One of the things we've actually asked for is, can we just simply start by having a portal where all the information, there's a regular information from the medical perspective, the number of patients with COVID-19, the number of recoveries, number of deaths that we have been receiving, and we appreciate that we've been receiving that every day. But other than that, we need that financial information. So can we have a portal where all this information is going to, so that is being published, so that Kenyans are able to access that information? I think the other matter as civil society that we need to focus on, and Wangari had talked about it in her opening, was the issue of transparency and accountability in public procurement. And one of the things that we have been actively pushing for as civil society organizations is that we need to embrace open contracting data standards in the publication of all COVID-19 procurement moving forward. We appreciate, about two weeks ago, following the presidential directive, that all procurements for COVID-19 by KEMSA and the Ministry of Health are published, and we get information on the companies, who owns these companies, that is the beneficial owners, the contract amounts. Once that directive was given, at least by the end of last month, or was it early this month, we're able to get that information from KEMSA, but we still want to know whether this will be routine, or will the president have to come out again and give another directive that we need this information published. So we need to have a routine where all COVID-19 related procurement is proactively published, and with specific information on the owners of the companies, and the amounts given, and so on, so that Kenyans are then able to hold the government to account, and also ensure that whatever services and goods or works are being procured out there are being given to competent, the contracts are being given to competent companies that they are then able to deliver, and we are able to, and that we're following due process as articulated in the procurement laws, and that we also are able to get value for money from the purchases or the services that we are seeking out there, particularly because, as you know, right, as I said earlier, that we are currently struggling. We're in a debt crisis, we don't have the money, so we don't want to see any more wastage of public resources, particularly through our procurement processes. Wangari also talked about the issue around emergency procurement guidelines. This is something that we require immediately, because the institutions that are currently procuring in response to COVID-19 need to be well guided. That yes, we understand that we're in an emergency, but then how do we still ensure that we are applying due process, that people are not taking advantage of that emergency to be able to benefit at a personal level? The other thing in regard to procurement that as civil society we must demand for is a market price index for all essential drugs and commodities that are required right now to support us in the management of COVID-19. And this is very important to guide all procuring entities, and to also provide a safeguard against the purchase of required items at inflated costs. I think lastly, what I want to also to add, as we continue to mobilize civil society and non-state actor action around these critical issues on access to information, public expenditure tracking at this point, and public procurement, I think we just need to encourage, the different formations that are coming out right now to ensure that the right thing is being done in regard to accountability in response to this COVID-19 crisis. We need to continue strengthening accountability networks, both at the national and at the county levels, especially at the county levels, because we know that counties are also procuring, counties are also responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, but then there may be limited efforts compared to what's happening at the national level. So we need to empower and try and enhance collective action, both at the national and at the county level. For us, we have been working very closely with civil society partners like IREX organization, the National Taxpayers Association. We've worked with Inuka and others, and also the private sector, the trade unions, professional associations, including the medical associations, to closely monitor this situation and call out breaches in the management of the pandemic. And that's something that we will continue to do. We'll continue to keep the government in its toes in regard to financial spending, and also reporting of how monies have been used. And I think we also need to encourage all Kenyans to be on the lookout, to be vigilant, because this is their money. And as I said, how we deal with COVID-19 now will determine how we recover as a country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila. And I think you raised some important points. I'm thinking through the response from the KEMSA CEO when asked, explain this, what happened? And I believe the response was, this was an unprecedented time. We received so many requests from so many quarters, some via SMS, some on phone, and we had to deliver. And then you look at the statement in the Auditor General's report, which says, unprecedented periods are not an excuse. essentially, for putting aside procurement policies and approaches and procedures. And I think that's important to bear in mind. I think the piece on access to information is absolutely critical, without which it becomes very difficult to lobby, to focus in and zoom in on areas whereas a collective civil society really does need to exert their efforts. So I think the access to information piece, absolutely. And to all the panelists, unfortunately, John is in an emergency, but I think this is a question that all of us can respond to. I think what's interesting about the last few months is certain terms have become common in how we describe the pandemic. You have COVIDpreneurs, you have #money heist, and as a country, we've had several painful experiences with systemic corruption and mismanagement of resources. In your view, Irene, Sheila, and Wangari, have the conditions of COVID resulted in the emergence of a more complex or distinct type of corruption and mismanagement, or is what we're observing fundamentally just much of the same?
Allow me just to add my voice on that question. So in terms of how the corruption that we continue to witness as a country, what has the face of it been? Has it really changed? I would say, in a sense, what has changed is the magnitude of that corruption. We're actually seeing it. I don't know whether there's anything past grand, but it's quite huge. But I would also say a bit of the comforting thing is that some of our investigative agencies, looking at the Office of the ODP, looking at the DCI, and the courts, even some of the decisions coming out of the judiciary, particularly in the context of also the corruption at the level of counties when we're talking about the governors and the likes. So I would say that the corruption itself has not fundamentally changed, because a lot of it, the one at least I have really been looking at, is still around procurement issues. So procurement is still the big thing, but it's the magnitude of the corruption that has really grown to what, in my honest opinion, I would not expect. People have become very bold in the way they do it. And a third observation for me is the fact that now we are getting professionals assisting in this corruption. And as a way, when Sheila was speaking, I was just looking at how can we then use, say, the unions, because the unions and the media, I think, for me, are critical in helping us out on this issue of corruption. The expose on the media, particularly what the doctors have brought out, is something that shows that if we can leverage on some of these professionals, we can be able to get information that in their ordinary discharge of their duties, information that they get even way before the investigative agencies come in. So my thinking is that now, having seen how professionals, is it auditors, bankers, have been supporting or have colluded together with the political class, so how do we then leverage on some of the more patriotic Kenyans, so to speak, within these unions? So I have seen in the recent past, some of the unions, particularly KMPDU, that the things they've been agitating for have not been more on their pays and salary. They've actually come out on public interest issues to say that we cannot continue working in hospitals that we have no drugs to give patients. We have no machinery. There's, no reagents that we can be able to treat some of the patients with. So how can we, even as civil society, have work closely with some of these unions to see where both of our interests merge and would be able to support in the anti-corruption, in the war against corruption. So I would say what I have observed is the role of professionals in some of these mega corruptions that we have seen. And again, how the unions have changed their face to a little bit of public interest, kind of advocacy. So how do we leverage on that to be able to move the anti-corruption further? I'm also looking at what I have mentioned, the media. A lot of the work in the recent past, particularly even on COVID, civil society, I think to some extent, we are playing catch up with the media. So we must see how we as media, as civil societies, is it training around just how to report these issues that we can support the media. But generally, in my observation, within this COVID-19 period, they've done an excellent job in trying to bring these things to the fore. And then lastly, which is not, you'll allow me, it's of what I'm speaking, just allow me to also mention the issue of how we can link both the national level and the county level interest to be able to add the voice to these issues around corruption. Remember that a lot of, we have said a lot of the money that has come to Kenya, some are things that we would have to pay to some of our lenders, ABC, and obviously this would reduce the amount that counties would get as equitable share in the long run. So probably the next financial year, as still this year, the amount was constant. So how do you then rope in institutions like the Senate to be able then to see and have the wider conversation to say this corruption, the net effect of corruption is that as we pay for debts and make repayments for services that never reached our people, but as an entity, as a Senate, we should be protecting the interest of counties. So rather than always seeing Senate coming up strongly when they think it's only the direct money and equitable share, how do we link this and say, it might not directly right now address the equitable share that comes to the county, but the long-term effect is this, so that we have strong institutions like the Senate supporting the war on anti-corruption. I think that would really give it momentum and things will be able to move. So just in a nutshell, I'm looking at the role of professionals, a lot of scrutiny on the role of professionals and how they can support this, particularly the unions. How do we support media? Because they have really shown leadership, at least some. I know we have to balance that out. And then how do we also rope some of these institutions like the Senate to look past the issues of just equitable share, but other things that the long term would impact on the amount that will come to them. And obviously that is corruption, that we pay, we actually get debt, we tax Kenyans, but we never get the services back. So I think it would be interesting to see how we engage with these institutions to kind of address the corruption that we see growing in terms of the size of what we are losing as a country. Many thanks.
Thank you, Irene. I think in the interest of time, we will move on to Q&A. I know a lot of folks have some burning questions, and I'll hand over to my colleague, George Kogola, who's going to moderate this next piece.
Well, thank you very much for the enlightening conversation. The questions are streaming in, and so far I think I have about nine questions to different panelists. I think one of them has been answered, and it's the one that was directed, I think, to Gary about why do budgets not include a provision for quarterly audits by certified bodies? Could this not help to discourage mismanagement? I think, Gary, you answered that on the chat. So allow me to proceed to the ones that we have received. And pretty interesting, when some to particular individuals, some would be open. But I think the first one is from Caroline Kamau, who says that the issues of governance in Kenya can be dated way back. We have seen cases of corruption in public finance erupt, yet we have seen none to little action taken. How can leaders mend the broken trust at such a time? And how can Kenyans verify information released to the public regarding public finances? I think I'll throw this to you, Gary.
Thank you, George. I think mine, to answer that, I would just put it very simply, and I think actions speak louder than words. People trust people's actions, and if you just make proclamations and you don't put your money where your mouth is, so to speak, then you lose the trust of the people. If you demonstrate that you're actually working for the will of the people, then you can start to build that trust. So mine is just a simple answer to that.
Thank you very much. We have an anonymous question posted here, and it's not really a question, but it's an interesting comment that says that the fact that Kenya has never experienced such an emergency or pandemic like other countries such as Uganda, don't you think that it's a bit unfair to expect much from the government? The government was in total confusion to the level that openness, accountability, and public participation would not be a priority. I believe that following the situation, Kenya will be in a better position to deal with such a pandemic next time. So they're sort of cutting the government some slack. And I'll probably throw this to Irene to make a 1-minute comment. Should we get the Kenyan government off the hook?
So yeah, thanks. I think government equally expects so much from its citizens, and I guess I always talk about taxes so much. So look at the current Finance Act. So there's digital tax coming in, there's turnover, there's quite a lot of taxes. So government expects a lot, and government does not cut us that slack. So I think government can learn, because it's not a lone country. There are very many countries, and in terms of planning, that's why you have planners, and it can only get worse, unfortunately. There's global warming, climate change issues. So it then means that government should have anticipated. I know the COVID one is unique, but I'm sure the lessons we get from COVID-19 are lessons we should take, because the context and the changing world then demands that our government understands and expects that some of these things should happen. And lastly, there are some issues that then you can say cut government some slack, but remember that the law itself, particularly on procurement, what broke my heart in a sense is when you're procuring some PPEs that our sisters in the medical field cannot use. But the procurement law allows you to co-opt professionals to help you procure and even look at the quality of the products. So there are some things that, in my opinion, seem to be deliberately geared at stealing from the Kenyan people. So just to try and understand that other context is that, yes, we can look at both scenarios, but there are scenarios clearly where you can see that there was deliberate effort and government not taking avenues and opportunities that are available to them to reduce. Because within a pandemic, I know the magnitude of what you're purchasing, the speed with which you need to respond, then obviously would allow for those percentages of, omissions and issues like that. But that is where then within such a crisis, you try and coordinate with other partners to ensure that whatever decision you make, even if citizens in a country would want to look at it, they say you looked at all available options before you coordinated and consulted widely. In our case, I don't think those options were explored, and I think that is why there's still a lot of push that the citizens would have expected more from its government.
Thank you very much. I think,
George?
Sorry. Yes, Sheila.
Hi. Yeah, that was such a provocative question. I think I don't want to let it pass because I for one, not as Sheila working for Transparency International Kenya, but Sheila as a citizen of this country who diligently pays taxes and still has to struggle with so many public services. I wouldn't cut government some slack in this, because as a government, we have resourced it, you have paid taxes, and one of the things that you task the government to do is plan. So we can't say that this thing just fell okay. Maybe in China it just happened because no one saw that happening. But by the time it happened in China and we could see that progression, how it was progressing into Africa, already we could see the government starting to plan. And I would really fault that if the government, or we already know that it started planning in terms of preparing the hospitals and making certain medical provisions. But then how do you plan all this without putting in place any accountability safeguards? And I think even, I really was interested in this question because I think it's something that we should emphasize moving forward. We need to ask for a long-term plan, because from where I sit, I don't feel like we have a comprehensive long-term plan. I understand the challenges in terms of planning right now, because everything is not in white and black. Everything is looking a bit gray, but the government has the resources. They have economists, they have planners, and all these professionals who can really just help piece things together. But I think the most important thing that we must demand from the government right now is that whatever plans we are putting in place, let us ensure that we are including oversight agencies, we are putting in place anti-corruption mechanisms, because failing to plan is planning to fail. And so we must hold the government to account in that regard and demand that moving forward, as we talk about the plans, as the president is giving his State of the Nation address, we should also demand that he's telling us something about accountability, how are resources going to be safeguarded moving on to the future. That is the assurance we need from the government moving on.
Thank you very much. I think Selina Kari agrees with you that Kenya is used to flood procurement processes, and this is not the first time. We've had issues with procurement processes, especially in the health sector before. So this emergency should be an escape. There's much to be rectified. So there's a need for pressure to be put so that these laws are followed and followed strictly. So she really doesn't agree with the issue of the emergency allowing us to take shortcuts. But she's wondering whether, as a country, we have the strength to investigate, and so really expressing the same anger. I'll move us on to the next question, and this one is from Samuel Komu. Over the COVID pandemic, the government has put in place a lot on social protection. So Irene, this I think comes to you, but we are yet to see the gains in terms of performance and monitoring of the programs, including the cash transfers. Eventually, the trend is we move to the next program and disbursement without showing tangible results. How best can we as players ensure accountability and transparency, as there are issues that come up, including on beneficiaries? The clear data is missing on social protection online registry platform. Do you have a comment, Irene, towards it?
Yes, so indeed, and not just specific to social protection, but generally our monitoring and evaluation as a country on most of our programs is not very clear. So this is something that needs to be institutionalized. It's there on paper, but on the ground, it's not there. And I think the push must come from citizens and the beneficiaries. My concern, and generally also with corruption, is that we have delegated a lot of the anti-corruption roles to institutions, so ethics and anti-corruption and the likes. But as citizens, I think when it happens in more real time, we can be able to address some of these things. So say you are the older group that should be benefiting from some of the social protection. You are the people living with disabilities. Do you even look at the audit reports that the Auditor General does for some of these funds? Because they are there, and I can tell you the last two that I've looked at, or rather we have looked at as an institution, are not, do not have good audit reports. But the beneficiaries are the rightful people to then demand accountability on this if government is not giving a clear monitoring and evaluation framework. So my answer to that is twofold. That then we need, as civil society and other external players, to ensure that even as we resource this area of social protection, then we demand for a very robust monitoring and evaluation framework whose findings are made public. But on the other hand, the beneficiaries who then ought to receive these funds, they themselves have to take the personal initiative to look at some of these audit reports, find out where is this money going. So if we address those two, I think we are halfway there, but a lot indeed needs to be done.
Thank you very much. I think we move to the next question, and the questions are flowing in. Some have been responded to, so you will allow me to just brush through them. But there's one here, and they're all related, with regard to corruption and accountability. Well, Gareth, this one is on effective financial management as being paramount, not only during the times of crisis, but generally. And being aware that crises such as COVID-19 create a loophole for corruption, how would we ensure proper targeting of interventions, value for money, and prevention of corrupt practices?
Thank you, and I do agree with you with Nixon, Omoro, that that there should be a disclosure for all these, the revenue raising measures, the fiscal budget spending, data audits, all of those should be disclosed. The question is, how do you compel these people to disclose them? It's already in the law, in the regular law outside of emergencies, but also in the COVID regulations that these should be disclosed, and yet we have seen no disclosure. How can we pressure? And of course, you know, accountability, transparency is a key tenet of PFM. So the question and the challenge for us is, we have all these things in law. People say Kenya has some of the best laws, but the question comes in implementation. How do we compel you know, these reports and data to be disclosed so that we can adequately interrogate and see how this financing has been used? I've not seen one data report from the COVID fund committee, and why? And so I guess that's why we have strong CSOs like Transparency International, for the National Taxpayers and Association, etc., to provide that kind of pressure. And I think with that continued pressure, then we will see them hopefully start to disclose this information.
Thank you very much. I think we move to probably, I think about 2-3 of my last questions. The next one goes to Sheila, and it's from Annette Nerima, who says, access to information certainly is a major impediment in the fight against corruption and mismanagement of public resources. In your view, Sheila, what opportunities presented by BBI and/or the constitutional amendment process towards sealing the loopholes and compelling responsible authorities to strictly adhere to set standards for PFM, transparency and accountability, and by extension, proactive disclosure of relevant information to the public?
Thank you very much, Annette, George, for that question. For me, what I'd say is we really don't even have to wait for BBI to seek access to information. We have Article 35 of the Constitution, which guarantees all Kenyan citizens the right to any information held for the public. Then we also have the Access to Information Law enacted in 2016, which came after a very, very long period and a long clamor by civil society actors and other public-spirited individuals. I think if you look at other provisions of the Constitution, the Article 10 on the national values and principles of governance, which promotes accountability, good governance, public participation, transparency, and so on. We already have constitutional provisions. We already have a law in place. We already have an institution, that's a Commission on Administrative Justice, and an Information Commissioner to oversight the matters pertaining to public's access to information. I think we as Kenyans, as a citizen, wherever you are, you should just take that initiative to test the system, you know, request for information. And I think as much as we are calling for proactive, we've been clamoring for proactive disclosure, what would really help also is citizens just jammed these public institutions with requests for information. So they finally see that it's actually easier to post that information on a portal somewhere or on a notice board or on a website, rather than to just try to keep on individually responding to individual letters or to keep on hiding those letters. I don't know where they're hidden, because we never get that, we never get responses to our letters anyway. I know there are some cabinet secretaries and other public officials who have even been bold, at least they've responded and actually just told us, no, you can't get that information, that is classified information. Yet it is information touching on money, public money that has been used for infrastructure projects like the SGR and so on. But I think for me, one starting point as a citizen of this country, just test the system. Write to the relevant public agency where you need information and just ask for that information. And when it's not forthcoming, there are other actions that one can then take up. As I've mentioned, for us, we've been forced to go to court, not once, not twice, but several other times, just to compel the government to give us information. Of course, this is not the ideal situation, because court is also another expensive affair in terms of monetary resources and also time. And that's where we need to get into a culture where the government is just proactively giving us that information as they get it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And I'll probably come back to you, Sheila, for a 30-second response, where James is talking about Transparency International has been ranking countries. He's asking whether it is a high time you started ranking individuals, and their roles in some of these economic crimes.
Do you want me to respond now?
Yes, if you could take 30 seconds to respond to that.
You know, when you look at those country ranks, like what we do with the Corruption Perception Index, which is really a global composite index, which looks at public sector corruption, but then ranks countries, because it's also based, it's an index of indices. It looks at other indices from, you know, the World Bank, Africa Development Bank, and other reputable institutions across the world. But a score of a country is really a reflection of the people who live or work in that country. So if we're talking about public sector corruption, then the ranking that we get as a country is really an indication of the people interacting within the public sector, you know, the people giving services, and also we also say that, you know, corruption takes two to tango. But it primarily, for me, it also implies the kind of people, the individuals that are forming our institutions, because before we go into the institutions, we have to look at the individual. And I think it's something that, again, we have also been looking at, you know, what is the individual's role in the fight against corruption, or in preventing or promoting corruption? Because I think now we've gotten to a point in Kenya where we have accountability, several accountability institutions. We have the Constitution, and it talks about Chapter 6 on leadership and integrity, very progressive provisions there. We have various laws touching on anti-corruption. But then there's still a question of, why do we still feel like we're not moving? The wheels are not turning in regard to the fight against corruption. So I always go back, it's about really the individuals that are, and that's something that we also now need to really look at moving on. What kind of cultural or behavior change do we then need to see in our country? But then it has to start at an individual level. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I'd like to recognize, I see that John Gidongo has joined us, but I'm swinging it back to Melissa for a final round of probably closing statements. Melissa, over and back to you.
Thank you so much. And John, since we have you on the call, you know, in about 4 minutes, it would be great to get your take on the following. You know, 8 months into Kenya's COVID response, what are your thoughts on where do we go from here in terms of course correcting, given that there are massive questions around accountability and transparency? John?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I wanted to start first of all by apologizing for the delay in showing up, as I've been a mechanic for the last couple of hours. The question that I'd been asked was about COVID-19 and the kind of corruption that we're seeing around it and what it means. And I'd like to take a step back and make two points to start with. Number one, 75% of our population in Kenya is below the age of 35. In 2022, people who were born when I joined government in 2003 will be voting. That is the most profound political reality that affects the way that we handle corruption in Kenya. And we are seeing the the impact of that demographic bulge across Africa. I'm sure you're following what's happening in Nigeria. You've seen what's been going on in Togo, Sudan, Ethiopia. And so this sweep is going to continue. This is the kind of pressure that COVID is putting on institutions, and young people, understandably, who are watching their lives sort of misspent away via corruption, are responding to that. That could be coming here, and it'll come from unexpected quarters. So that's something to anticipate for us as Kenyans, just given our demographics. Secondly, a major change has taken place since I first got involved in Transparency International in the mid-1990s and now, which is basically the globalization of the economy and financialization. That in the past we talked of politicians, bureaucrats, and businessmen being the key players involved in anti-corruption, in corruption activity, in corrupt activities. That has changed now. And key players now include the services sector, the law, banking, auditing, are now key players in the corrupt transactions, even the ones that are being reported here in Kenya. And that's something which we need to be mindful of. Thirdly, in the 80s and 90s, we used to have different types of corruption. We had petty corruption, which is the little money that people give to a policeman not to disturb you when your tires are bald or something, you don't have, your license is expired. We had grand corruption, which was basically politicians and bureaucrats skimming off large public works contracts. And then we used to have another term that we used, especially with regard to what was happening in parts of Africa and Latin America, which we called looting, which was where the institutions were so degraded that the leadership could literally pick up the phone, call the Minister of Finance, call the governor of the central bank and say, listen, I need $20 million, I'm going to Switzerland, and that money would be made available. And there's a sense that we had passed that, that with the reintroduction of multi-party politics, the adoption of liberal constitutions, that we had passed that. But there's a new trend that we are seeing, and that has been discussed here in Kenya, which is this, which is another form of looting, which is budgeted corruption, where it's premeditated, where a group of people, part of the elite, can sit down and decide we're going to create a project that we have absolutely no intention of implementing. However, we shall budget for it and we shall spend on it, and those resources will go into the pockets of individuals. This is a phenomenon that we've seen in Kenya, but it's not unique to Kenya. We are seeing it across West Africa as well, of this a new kind of looting. And it is covered quite cleverly in countries, common law countries like Kenya. I often tell people, if you're looking to see where the corruption is, especially this budgeted looting, you look at the Gazette notices, the miscellaneous amendments, and the small changes that are made that exempt certain companies from taxes and the like, and that's where the difficulties are. But for me, in concluding, our day of challenge as Kenyans is coming. We're in the middle of a political cycle. COVID has hammered the economy. The economy is expected to contract by 3% this year. It's an overwhelmingly young population. And I think as the financial distress deepens, there will be reactions that will be quite unexpected, just as the people of Lagos are finding out now. Similar things are going to happen in Kenya.
Thank you so much, John. And I think the takeaway there is that, unfortunately, what we're seeing is much of the same. However, in terms of corruption and what the dynamics and nuances of corruption historically we've come to become accustomed to as Kenyans, but the impact and the timing at which COVID has arrived for the country, alongside and parallel to youth becoming more vocal, finding their voice, gathering with more focus across the continent, means that the impacts for our country could be quite severe. and I imagine in social, political, and economic context. We are over time, so this is just to say a big thank you to our panelists for being part of this conversation. We value your time, we value your insights, and I, for one, have thoroughly taken away a lot from this session. To the attendees, thank you so much for joining us. We know that putting aside 90 minutes of your time is an opportunity cost. We don't take that for granted. A quick note to share that the webinar will be available online, and you can expect a link or two after this, in addition to some slides that Wangari has kindly pulled together for us to give us a real expert lens and snapshot into PFM and the COVID pandemic. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.